The Ipuwer Papyrus was originally dated no earlier than the 19th Dynasty, but it is now agreed that the text itself is much older and dated back to the Middle Kingdom, though no earlier than the late 12th Dynasty. Now, the Middle Kingdom happens to end with the 12th Dynasty, and this means that the Ipuwer Papyrus is effectively dated between the late period of the 12th Dynasty and its end. Ipuwer has often been put forward in popular literature as confirmation of the biblical account of the Exodus, most notably because of its statement that the river is blood and its frequent references to servants running away. In the poem, Ipuwer, a name typical of the period between 1850 BC to 1450 BC, demands that the Lord of all, a title which can be applied both to the king and to the creator sun god, should destroy his enemies and remember his religious duties. This period between 1850 BC to 1450 BC is interesting because in my previous video titled 2033, God's Final Jubilee and the Second Coming of Christ, Part 1, I dated the year of the Exodus from Egypt at 1487 BC. This supports the belief that the Ipuwer Papyrus is about the Exodus that occurred during the 12th Dynasty. In this video, I will now identify the 12th Dynasty Pharaoh and Queen that saw the 10 plagues and the Exodus. Exodus chapter 1 verses 8 to 11. Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built Hebrew Baunau for Pharaoh, treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. Because one of the cities built for the Pharaoh mentioned in Exodus chapter 1 verse 11 was named Ramses, many scholars hastily conclude that the Pharaoh must have been the 19th Dynasty Pharaoh, Ramses II, who built Pi Ramses, meaning House of Ramses, as his new capital near the old site of Avaris. Now the Hebrew word Baunau, which means to build, that was used in Exodus chapter 1 verse 11 was also used in 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1. And I quote, In the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build Hebrew Baunau, the temple of the Lord. End of quote. Now beginning to build the temple of the Lord implies laying down its foundation first. Therefore, the Hebrew word Baunau implies that the builder of a city, or any structure for that matter, must also be its original founder. In contrast, the Hebrew word Kaudash, which means to be new, renew, repair, was used in 2 Chronicles chapter 24 verse 4, and I quote, Sometime later, Joash decided to restore Hebrew Kaudash, the temple of the Lord. In my opinion, Exodus chapter 1 verse 11 should have used Kaudash if its intended meaning was to build something new on a pre-existing old site, like what Ramses II did to Avaris. Now Avaris was originally founded by the first pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, Amenemhat I, on the eastern branch of the Nile in the Delta. Its close proximity to Asia made it a popular town for Asiatic immigrants. Many of these immigrants were from Palestine, and they were culturally Egyptianized using Egyptian pottery, but also retained many aspects of their own culture, as can be seen from the various Asiatic burials, including weapons of Syro-Palestinian origin. These Asiatic immigrants during the reign of Amenemhat I, in my opinion, must have included the children of Israel. Thus, I believe the Pharaoh mentioned in Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 to 11, who was alarmed by the great and increasing number and might of Israeli immigrants in Egypt, was Amenemhat I, who was probably the same as the vizier named Amenemhat under his predecessor Mentuhotep IV, and who possibly overthrew him from power. Note also that Amenemhat I was not of royal lineage and not related to the Pharaoh who preceded him. And for me, this explains why Exodus chapter 1 verse 8 described him as a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. But you might ask, if the city was named Avaris at the time of the Exodus during the 12th Dynasty of Egypt, why did the Bible name it Ramses instead, which was the name of the new capital of the 19th Dynasty Pharaoh, Ramesses II? Keep in mind that the oldest extant Tanakh manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible are dated circa 650 to 587 BC, which is several hundred years after the Exodus. And Bible translators and copyists are known to change the original name of a biblical location to the name currently known to them during their time. One case in point is Genesis chapter 2 verse 14, which mentioned two rivers named Hiddekel and Perat in its original Hebrew, but which were named Tigris and Euphrates instead by the 3rd century BC Jewish translators of the Greek Septuagint. The other city named in Exodus chapter 1 verse 11 was Pithom, which literally means house or temple of Atum. Atum is the primordial god in Egyptian mythology from whom all else arose. He created himself and is the father of Shu and Tefnut, the divine couple who are the ancestors of the other Egyptian deities. Atum is also closely associated with the evening sun. I believe Atum was the Lord of all referred to in the Ipuwer Papyrus, which I mentioned earlier at the start of this video. His center of worship centered on the city of Heliopolis, which was one of the oldest cities of ancient Egypt, occupied since the pre-dynastic period. In other words, Heliopolis was founded much earlier than the 12th dynasty of Amenemhat I. It is now located in Ain Shams, a northeastern district of Cairo. El Matareya is a district in the eastern area of Cairo and located nearby Ain Shams, or the former Heliopolis, about 11.8 kilometers away. The El Masala area of the El Matareya district contains the ancient Masala obelisk, one of the Pharaonic era obelisks that still remain in Egypt. This obelisk is standing in its original position and part of the great temple of Ra-Atum, constructed by the second pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, Senusret I, who succeeded Amenemhat I. Now, while Senusret I constructed the great temple of Atum, or Pithom, and its obelisk, I believe Amenemhat I may have been the original founder and the first one who built a city in El Matareya, which I believe was named Pithom in Exodus chapter 1 verse 11. In 2004, a domed tomb made for a priest during the 26th dynasty, circa 685 BC to 525 BC, was discovered under a construction site in El Masala area, where Senusret I's obelisk is standing. Now remember that the oldest extant Tanakh manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible are dated circa 650 to 587 BC, which was during the 26th Dynasty period. This proves that the house or temple of Atum, called Pithom by Exodus chapter 1 verse 11, was still being used and known by this name at the time the earliest copy of the Exodus was made. I mentioned earlier that I dated the year of the Exodus from Egypt at 1487 BC. However, the 12th dynasty of Egypt is dated by historians between 1991 BC to 1802 BC, which is at least 315 years earlier than when I believe the Exodus took place. So how do I justify this big discrepancy? In my previous video titled Solomon's Gold Mines in Ophir and Ancient Egypt's Land of Punt were in the Indus Valley Civilization, I argued that Egyptologists dated the reign of the 10th pharaoh of the 18th Dynasty, Akhenaten, 364 years too early. And by subtracting 364 years from the dates given by Egyptologists to the 12th dynasty, we get a corrected period of 1627 BC to 1438 BC, which now includes the 1487 BC date I gave for the time of the Exodus. Towards the end of this video, I will post an excerpt of my astronomical proof for this claim. But for now, allow me to discuss several reasons why the pharaohs and the events of the 12th dynasty of Egypt best suit the narrative in the book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 2 verses 5 to 10, we are introduced to a certain pharaoh's daughter and her discovery of the Hebrew child Moses in the Nile River and her willful defiance of her father's orders that all male Hebrew children should be drowned in the Nile. Instead, she took the child whom she knows to be a Hebrew and raised him as her own son. The historian Josephus, in his work Antiquities of the Jews, Book 2, Chapter 9, verses 5 to 7, tells us that the Pharaoh's daughter, whom Josephus named Thermuthis, was the Pharaoh's successor, so much so that by adopting Moses as her own son, Thermuthis claimed that Moses will become an heir of the Pharaoh's throne. Neferuptah was a daughter of the 6th Pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, Amenemhat III. Her younger sister was Sobekneferu, who would eventually become the 8th and last Pharaoh of that dynasty. Neferuptah is one of the first royal women whose name was written inside a cartouche. Although she never had the title king's wife, she must have had a special status, and it is possible that she was regarded as a future ruler and successor of her father Amenemhat III. In my opinion, Neferuptah fits the description of the Pharaoh's daughter as written both in the book of Exodus as well as in Josephus' historical account. Amenemhat IV was the 7th Pharaoh of the 12th dynasty who succeeded Amenemhat III. This means Neferuptah, who was originally the presumptive successor of her father Amenemhat III, must have died before Amenemhat III and Amenemhat IV. The historian Manetho states that Amenemhat IV married his sister Sobekneferu, who I mentioned earlier was the younger sister of Neferuptah and who would eventually become the successor of Amenemhat IV. However, Egyptologist Kim Ryholt has proposed that Amenemhat IV was just adopted by Amenemhat III and not Amenemhat III's natural son, thus becoming Sobekneferu's step-brother. This could explain the Manetonian tradition of Amenemhat IV marrying his sister Sobekneferu. It also explains why Sobekneferu, the younger sister of Neferupta, became an heir presumptive of Amenemhat III upon Neferupta's early death and before she married Amenemhat IV and before Amenemhat IV became Amenemhat III's adopted son. More plausibly, Amenemhat IV may have died without a male heir, which could explain why he was succeeded by his wife Sobekneferu. Finally, the tomb of Amenemhat IV has not been identified. The 13th Dynasty, which succeeded the 12th upon the end of Sobekneferu's reign, is usually described as an era of chaos and disorder. This period was undoubtedly characterized by decline, with a large number of kings with short reigns and only a few attestations. The true chronology of the 13th dynasty is difficult to determine as there are few monuments dating from the period. Egyptologists date the end of Amenemhat IV's reign, who I believe was the pharaoh who saw the 10 plagues and the Exodus at 1806 BC. If I deduct 364 years from this date to correct the error in dating Akhenaten's reign, that was 364 years too early, we get 1442 BC as the year of his death and therefore of the Exodus. However, as I mentioned earlier, I dated the Exodus at 1487 BC instead, which is 45 years earlier than 1442 BC. So how do I account for this difference? The Turin canon is believed to assign a reign of 19 years to Senusret II and 30 years of reign to Senusret III. However, current Egyptian chronology gave Senusret III 39 years reign instead, or an excess of 9 years. This traditional view was challenged when the Egyptologist William Kelly Simpson observed that the latest attested regnal year for Senusret II was his 7th, and similarly for Senusret III, his 19th. If William Kelly Simpson is correct, and I agree with him, this means Senusret II's reign, according to current Egyptian chronology, is 12 years too long, while Senusret III's reign is 20 years too long, making the 12th dynasty chronology 32 years too late, starting with Senusret II. Current Egyptian chronology lists Mentuhotep IV as the last king of the 11th dynasty. It is possible that he was a son of Mentuhotep II, thus a brother or half-brother of Mentuhotep III, his supposed predecessor. The fact that he has been omitted from several king lists indicates that there was a crisis in the order of succession. While he represents the last king of the 11th dynasty, his reign is poorly documented, indicating turmoil. In my opinion, Mentuhotep IV was not a legitimate pharaoh of the 11th dynasty, but a pretender to the throne of Mentuhotep III only. Thus, the 7 years assigned to his reign coming after Mentuhotep III's reign should coincide instead with the last 7 years of Mentuhotep III. But because current Egyptian chronology assigned Mentuhotep IV's 7 years reign after Mentuhotep III's reign, this means the 12th dynasty that followed Mentuhotep IV's reign is dated 7 years too late. Contemporary records refer to 7 empty years following the death of Mentuhotep III, which correspond to the reign of Mentuhotep IV. In my opinion, the 7 empty years of Mentuhotep III were the last 7 years of his reign, during which Mentuhotep III was sidelined by the pretender of his throne, Mentuhotep IV. Intef I is the third pharaoh of the 11th Dynasty, whose reign is estimated between 4 to 16 years. This allows a possible maximum error of 12 years late dating of the reigns of pharaohs starting with Intef I onwards. Adding up all the errors in dating I have discussed so far, I have already accounted for between as low as 39 years to as high as 51 years late dating of Amenhotep IV's final year, believed to be 1442 BC instead of the 1487 BC which I expected. For me, Amenemhat IV is the ideal candidate for the Pharaoh of the Exodus if ever there is one. His body and tomb were not found, presumably because he drowned in the Red Sea, and his corpse was not recovered. His queen, Sobekneferu, succeeded him, presumably because their firstborn son died earlier, leaving him with no male heir. The 12th Dynasty was in decline by the time of Sobekneferu's ascension, probably caused by the plagues that visited Egypt and the overwhelming defeat of the Egyptian army in the hands of the children of Israel. But more importantly, the end of Amenemhat IV's reign closely matches my dating of the year of the Exodus, that is, after applying the 364 years correction of Akhenaten's faulty reign dating, as well as the other corrections I just discussed. And to add to all this is the Ipuwer Papyrus that is seen as proof of the Exodus by many Bible scholars and conclusively dated by Egyptologists during the 12th Dynasty, which was when Amenemhat IV reigned. Prior to the Exodus, Joseph, son of Jacob and Rachel, became vizier, the highest official in ancient Egypt to serve the pharaoh under the name of Safnat-Paneah, and was given Asenat, the daughter of Potipherah, priest of On, to be his wife. In his famous interpretation of the pharaoh's dream, Joseph predicted 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of famine happening in Egypt during his time. I identify Ankhtifi, a nomarch or provincial governor of Nekhen, as the historical Joseph during the 9th Dynasty of Egypt. Ankhtifi and Joseph had a very similar story. I will be discussing this topic in my next video. And as promised earlier, I will now append an excerpt of my previous video titled Solomon's Gold Mines in Ophir and Ancient Egypt's Land of Punt were in the Indus Valley Civilization, that discusses an astronomical proof for my claim that Akhenaten's reign was dated 364 years too early. In my previous video titled Nefertiti, the Queen of Sheba, I argued that Akhenaten's historical reign, circa 1351 to 1334 BC, was dated more than 300 years too early by Egyptologists. This was caused by an erroneous interpretation of the KTU 1.78 astronomical text which Egyptologists used to date Akhenaten's reign. This tablet mentions a solar eclipse in Ugarit which dated May 3, 1375 BC. However, a very similar eclipse occurred on April 29, 1011 BC, which I believe was the correct one instead. Let me explain and prove to you why. Using stellarium and setting the algorithm of delta t to JPL horizons, the location to Ugarit with coordinates 35 degrees, 36 minutes, 7.2 seconds north, 35 degrees, 46 minutes, 55.2 seconds east. The date to May 3, 1375 BC, or negative 1374 in astronomical year numbering, and at 3:51:45 UTC, one can see a solar eclipse in Taurus with maximum solar obscuration of 95.81% occurring 55 minutes after sunrise. Now, using stellarium and setting the algorithm of delta t to JPL horizons, the location to Ugarit with coordinates 35 degrees, 36 minutes, 7.2 seconds north, 35 degrees, 46 minutes, 55.2 seconds east. But the date to April 29, 1011 BC, or negative 1010 in astronomical year numbering, and at 5:09:30 UTC instead, one can see a solar eclipse also in Taurus with maximum solar obscuration of 73.71% occurring 2 hours 11 minutes after sunrise, or only 1 hour 16 minutes later than the May 3, 1375 BC eclipse. Furthermore, May 3, 1375 BC and April 29, 1011 BC were both Nisan 30 of their corresponding years, except that the April 29, 1011 BC eclipse happened 364 years after the May 3, 1375 BC eclipse. Now, why do I think April 29, 1011 BC was the correct date for the eclipse? The English translation of the KTU 1.78 astronomical text is as follows: 6th day, new moon, Hiyaru, enter sun, her gate, Reshep. This astro shorthand is believed to be written by an Egyptian and should be interpreted as hour 6, day of the new moon of Hiyaru, when the sun entered into Hathor's, her gate, in Taurus, Reshep. Now, what is hour 6 in ancient Egypt? It actually refers to the sixth decan. The ancient Egyptians conveniently divided the 360-degree ecliptic into 36 parts of 10 degrees each, and the decans each appeared geocentrically to rise consecutively on the horizon throughout each daily Earth rotation. The rising of each decan marked the beginning of a new decanal hour. On the May 3, 1375 BC eclipse, the last decanal hour to rise above the horizon during the eclipse was the fourth decan, corresponding to 40-degree right ascension as measured from the first point of Aries. During the April 29, 1011 BC eclipse, the last decanal hour to rise above the horizon during the eclipse was the sixth decan, corresponding to 60-degree right ascension. And the KTU 1.78 astronomical text specifically said that it was during the sixth decan, not the fourth, that the recorded eclipse was observed. Thus, there can be no doubt about it. The April 29, 1011 BC eclipse was the one described in the KTU 1.78 astronomical text. Subtracting 364 years from the current historical dating of Akhenaten's reign, we get the corrected period of 987 to 970 BC instead. And this makes Akhenaten a contemporary of King David circa 1010 to 970 BC, as well as King Solomon, circa 970 to 931 BC. Now, according to Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 8, paragraph 165 to 173, the Queen of Sheba, a believer of the God of Israel, was the Queen of Egypt and Ethiopia. I believe Nefertiti, the wife of the monotheist Pharaoh Akhenaten and contemporary of King Solomon, was the legendary Queen of Sheba. Note also that Akhenaten's reign ended in 970 BC, just when Solomon's reign started. This means Nefertiti was no longer queen of Egypt when she met King Solomon, but was already known as the Queen of Sheba, believed to be Saba, Ethiopia, after presumably marrying the King of Ethiopia soon after Akhenaten died.